Thank you all for being here tonight. I'm really excited to be participating in this event. I've actually had previous opportunities to talk about my personal experience with rare disease, and I've had opportunities to talk about my research in rare disease, but this is the first time I'm able to combine these two experiences into one discussion, and I want to thank the McGill rareDIG group and Jesse for inviting me to speak here tonight and try my hand at something new. So I hope that it's enjoyable for you. So I'm going to start at the beginning of my story, which is my personal experience with rare disease. And that happened about a few weeks after my first son was born. So about 3 weeks in, after a really, really hard birth, a baby with low muscle tone, failed hearing tests, apnea episodes, and seriously, you name it, my husband and I were given a really devastating diagnosis, Zellweger Syndrome, and that was referred to as the most severe form of a disease called Zellweger Spectrum Disorder, or ZSD, which is how I'll be referring to it for the rest of the evening. ZSD is an often life-limiting, multi-system disorder, and our doctors told us that Ilan probably wouldn't see his first birthday. So the doctors did everything to make Ilan comfortable. They did everything to keep him safe, and at 3 months, we were discharged from the NICU, and we went home to start our life with Ilan. Now, if I went into what I thought were the most important points of the 14 months that we had with Ilan, we'd probably be here for another 14 months. So instead, I'll let these pictures behind me give you just a little glimpse into our life with Ilan. As you can see, we packed a lot into those 14 months. We celebrated a birthday. We celebrated holidays. We saw family. We danced. We went to the 7-Eleven and had Slurpees. We did a lot with him. Life with Ilan was absolutely amazing. Life with ZSD was really, really hard. And what I would like to focus on in talking about my personal experience is share a little bit about what I went through as the caregiver of a child with a rare terminal disorder. There's two things I want to really focus on to help kind of segue into my research interests. And the first is, I was insane, like certifiable. I had this torrent of emotions that just went up and down, and stress, and my husband, he went through the same experience too, and we both felt awful for feeling this way. This was supposed to be the time that we were basking in the joy of our newborn son, and we did get a little bit of that, but in addition to that, there was anger, there was fear, there was guilt, and there was a whole heap of stress. It took a dramatic toll on our physical and emotional well-being, and there was no one around us who had experienced what we went through, so there was no one to tell us that these feelings were okay or normal, so we were guilt-ridden all the time. It deeply affected and often interfered with the way that we took care of Ilan. My husband actually wanted me to share a particular story when things were just going off the rails. There was a lot of stuff going on. We had a hard time keeping track of everything that we had to do. And in giving Ilan his routine meds, my husband had actually accidentally given him 3 times the dose of a seizure medication he was on. Ilan slept for 3 days. We thought we lost him. That guilt that we were experiencing, much, much higher. We eventually got to the point where we started identifying some coping mechanisms to try to deal with this experience. I started journaling and blogging, eventually went to counseling, but it was a lot, and it had a deep impact on influencing my later research interests. The other thing I want to talk to you about being the caregiver to a child with a rare disease is the role that I was slowly learning, the important role that I was learning that I played in coordinating Alon's medical care. Alon being both an infant and someone with severe developmental issues. He couldn't talk to his doctors. So it was up to me to inform them on what was going on with him so that they could prescribe proper care. I was the one who knew whether or not he was more congested that day. I was the one who knew how many and what kind of seizures he was having that day. I was the one who knew if he was tolerating his feeds that day. And I was the one who knew if he was happy or unhappy that day. My observations of his day-to-day became clinical intake information that doctors would be able to use to prescribe appropriate care at that particular point. And at the risk of sounding a little arrogant, the more the doctors listened to what I was saying and made recommendations based on my words to them, the better Alon tended to be. This was also a really important starting point and foundation for my later research interests. When Alon died, my postdoctoral advisor had given me the opportunity to come back and finish my fellowship in obesity and diabetes research. It was a very, very generous offer, but I ended up declining. I just couldn't go back to that same building, that same office where I was before Alon was born, like nothing had ever happened. I needed to acknowledge that something really big did happen, despite Alon's short time with us. My biggest fear was that, given that short amount of time, that Alon was going to be forgotten, perhaps even by me. And I knew that going back to my old life, my old job, would have brought that fear closer to realization. So I walked away from my research career. So what did I do next? Well, I had another child. I'll talk about that later. I also got involved with a relatively new advocacy organization in ZSD, and it was through my communications with them that I was able to interact with a number of organizations and institutions and people affiliated with these organizations and institutions. And it was through this network that I was able to find my voice again in research, now in a field that was so close to home to me. So I'd like to spend the rest of my time talking a little bit about the work that I've done in rare disease. When I was first given the opportunity to explore my own research initiatives, I quickly thought back to my time being Alon's caregiver and what a jarring emotional experience that was and how isolating it was. And I wondered if other people in my situation felt the same way and if it had the same sort of impact that it had on me. So I did a little digging, and I found that in the field of chronic pediatric illness, the stress level of a caregiver can actually affect the health outcomes of the patient, of the child, both psychologically and physically. But there were very few studies looking at this in pediatric rare disease, and there were certainly no studies looking at this in ZSD. So here was my first research question. What is the emotional experience of the rare disease caregiver? I had recently become familiarized with qualitative research, and I thought that a focus group would be an appropriate approach to trying to answer this question. Given my close connection with the ZSD community, I started there. So what do? We went to our family advocacy meetings, and we conducted a series of focus groups asking these questions. And here's what we found out. So the ZSD caregiver goes through a whole variety of emotions. At least a third of the people that participated in this study used a specific term to describe their emotional experience: roller coaster. The most common emotions that were expressed were anxiety, devastation, fear, and guilt. There were a number of circumstances that triggered these emotions, including the never-ending multitude of tasks associated with being the caregiver of a medically complex child. The impact that the disease had, not just on the child, but also their siblings. And one of the most common triggers or stressors for the emotional experience of the ZSD caregiver, interestingly enough, was the poor interactions they had with their child's medical care providers. People described experiences where doctors were absolutely unwilling to explore treatment options for their child because of the life-limiting nature of the disease. Parents described times where they felt like their voice wasn't taken into account and their expertise on their child wasn't incorporated in how care was prescribed for their child. Still others just overall lacked empathy when conveying sensitive information to these families about their child. The parents also described various coping strategies to help deal with these emotional experiences and these stressors. Some described the use of support systems, both familial and otherwise. Some talked about kind of cognitively changing the way that they looked at their circumstances and their experiences, where they redefined what normal family life was and was actually able to appreciate the unique experience of being the caregiver to a child with CSD. And a very common coping strategy that our parents described was advocating on behalf of their child and behalf of the overall patient community. The conclusions that we came to in the study is that in understanding the caregiver experience in rare disease, in this case CSD, was really good insight into understanding the whole patient-family experience. Additionally, we also realized that in these conversations, in listening to what these parents' experiences and needs were, we were actually able to identify potential points of intervention that could be easily addressed with regards to their emotional experience and other things to help improve the lives of these families, even in the face of no treatment options. So I used the information in the ZSD focus group study as a way to start trying to understand the emotional experience as a facet of this idea of quality of life. And I started going to meetings that talked about quality of life research. I learned about the different domains that were important in understanding quality of life, and I learned about the perspectives that we needed to hear in order to understand what quality of life meant to a specific community. I used this new knowledge to help reframe some of the data that I had from the ZSD focus group study. And when I presented this data in this new context at meetings, I was actually given the opportunity to actually define and measure quality of life in another rare disease population, rhizomelic chondrodysplasia punctata, or RCDP, which I'll be calling it for the rest of the evening. So RCDP is another multi-system, complex, heterogeneous disorder. And my sort of opinion in rare disease, one of the biggest sort of issues that I find in rare disease, besides no treatment options, is a lack of appropriate and measurable outcomes for these patients. This is particularly the case in these multi-system, complex, multi-symptom disorders. It's certainly the case in RCDP, where you don't really know what is it that you need to measure in order to determine the effectiveness of any type of therapy. So my role in this project was actually to develop a quality of life survey instrument with the intent of using this in clinical trials, but that instrument needed to be developed using the input of the families. So my next research question was, what is the day-to-day impact of RCDP on the lives of the patients and on the lives of the families? I used the same approach as I did with the ZSD focus group study, and I asked questions specifically of these parents as to how RCDP affected the day-to-day of their kids, of them. And I got an incredible amount of information, 150 pages worth actually. And I was able to take these conversations listening to their words, and transform this into domains that were appropriate to understanding quality of life in this particular disease, whether it was the impact that this disease had on respiratory symptoms, seizures, or just overall happiness. These domains will be used to build out into a survey instrument that, once it's validated, will actually be used in clinical trials for this particular community, bringing this particular population one step closer to finding treatment options that have meaningful outcomes. And I can't tell you what it meant to me to be a part of that process. So I know I said that I was going to talk mostly about research, but I just want to talk about one more personal thing. These conversations with these families have had a deep impact on me as a parent. There's so many things about my time with Alon that I still, even after so many years, I can't wrap my head around. And having these conversations with these families, listening to their words, actually helped me identify some aspects of my own experience. And really, doing this research actually helped me heal in a lot of ways, to the point where I've kind of been able to pick up the pieces of what's happened in my life and become whole again, to feel happy again, and to feel like I'm part of a very special group of people. My family who likes pizza and Spider-Man cake. We were blessed with 2 healthy boys after Alon passed away, and we do our best to enjoy our time together, despite the fact that Alon's not here. But it's really important to me that they know about their older brother, who he was, and other kids like him. And we do that by sharing our stories about Alon with them. So here's the major points that I was trying to make in my long-windedness here. If you are in the rare disease space, and I know all of us are, listen to the stories that your families tell you. If you are a caregiver or a patient with a rare disease, listening might actually help you better understand your own experience. If you are a practitioner in the field, listening may help you prescribe better care. If you are a researcher in the field, listening might help you actually identify effective treatments that have important, meaningful outcomes that matter to these communities. Share these stories. Share them with anyone and everyone who will listen. Share them enough to the point that we're able to identify similar experiences, even across rare disease communities. Because when we do that, when we can identify these shared experiences, we can approach them and address them with more systemic, more public health type strategies to help improve the lives of these patients and these families. And in doing this, we will be able to better understand, better identify, and better learn what are truly the needs of the rare disease community, what matters to them, and that will help us better serve them. So I mentioned this huge network that helped me reach my research goals. These are the actual people that made all of this research possible. A few of them are here tonight, so thank you. I want to thank you for your time, and I'll be happy to talk to you guys afterwards.